So I am Naya, she, her. I am a Brazilian immigrant living in the US, currently in Japan, temporarily. Um, and my research is about Brazilian immigrants living in the US, more specifically Brazilian parents raising their children in the US. Um, and what motivated me to do this research was one, the lack of research on Brazilians living in the US in general. And my sense of, as a Brazilian and being part of a doctoral program, I really felt like, if not me, who else? So I felt a need to also fill in the gap and learn more about my community. So this research poster is a fragment of a bigger research project that I conducted, started in 2019 in a specific region in the United States, the Pacific Northwest, where I'm located. So just briefly going through the poster, the United States has approximately 45 million of immigrants. That's what one of the latest census tell us. So it's the region where a lot of people immigrated to. Then it's not news to anybody probably. The Latinx individuals also represent the largest minority group, as most people probably heard, accounting for almost 19% of the population. And Brazilians are a growing immigrant population. And in the Brazilian side, the Brazilian census also showed that the United States is the um, the primary destination chosen by Brazilians to immigrate. So, despite of all of that, we do not have literature on Brazilians in the United States. So another difference of Brazilians that is important to note is that although we do share a lot of cultural values with our neighboring countries, we also have differences in our culture. One of the things that's more salient is the language. We do not speak Spanish, we speak Portuguese as we were colonized by Portugal, and then we also have a large African cultural influence in Brazil. And then a little bit about the lit review conducted for this poster. We identified, we looked through the reasons why people immigrated, and it was congruent with the immigration literature. So people immigrated because of several different reasons, then being advantages, economic prospects, or cultural exchange, or even as a refugee from several different circumstances that they might be going through in their native land. And then we also noticed that Latinx communities struggle and have different struggles throughout their immigration process, can be pre-immigration, during immigration, and then post-immigration. Some of those struggles might be, or negative experiences might be, threats of deportation, xenophobia, and anti-immigration sentiment from different avenues that they might receive. And then when immigrating as a family, since this poster also focused on families immigrating, parents were also concerned about their children well-being, which increased then their own stress. And then the methodology of this poster, we started up with a research open-ended question, as it was an exploratory study, asking what are the experiences of Brazilian immigrant parents raising their children in the US. So we started with a open-ended question, and we also conducted a semi-structured interview with standardized questions. So we utilized a mixed method approach. As I mentioned before, the Brazilians in this study were all first-generation immigrants, and they were living in a region in the Pacific Northwest. The sample was collected by social media groups focusing and targeting Brazilian immigrants specifically. And we used for this poster the brief resilience scale to talk about resilience, which is a 6-item survey. And then our resilience framework is also one that aligns with our cultural values. The early investigations on resilience usually center on the individual traits of resilience. So it's a very individualistic, it started out as very individualistic, and then we decided to use a more collectivistic resilience framework to match cultural values, of course. And the framework that we used believed that resilience is built in community, and is fostered in community. And then I have a quote there saying that resilience occurs via connection to both ourselves and others. And that was something we noticed in the results as well as people reflected on their journey. And then I used descriptive analysis and thematic analysis for the results of this study. So in total, we interviewed 19 participants. All of them were females, not by requirement of this study, but just because those are the people who reached out to us. When asked, do you have a support network in the US? 89% of the participants answered yes. And then we also were interested in see who are these people the support network made of, the composition, and they told us that mostly comprised of Brazilians and some Americans. So we noticed 2 Brazilians immigrating and then connecting with other Brazilians immigrant in the region. And then over half of the participants endorsed that the lack of extended family was the most difficult aspect of living in the US. So those are our brief results. I also added here some emergent themes that came out with the descriptive, with the thematic analysis. So one theme, the first theme that showed up is the openness to change. What the Brazilians noticed is that when immigrating, it is important to be open to change, and they did describe that openness before the immigration even started, the mindset of understanding that there's going to be changes and we need to be open to them. So that I also added an example of how we coded that. So it says it takes a lot of adaptation. You need to accept change and be flexible. That was one participant's words. The next theme was the support network. Participants also noticed that it's really important to establish a support network upon arrival to United States. So that was another advice that the sample had for future immigrants. When you immigrate, you need to establish your support, your community. That is really, really important. And they did that with, as I mentioned, with other Brazilians in the same situation. And then an example of this theme was try to integrate yourself in the community. So a direct advice. And then the final emergent theme that we noticed for this poster was embracing challenges. The participants emphasized that despite hardships and despite the process of immigration being really hard, it was worth it. At the end, it was worth it. They had the sentiment of it's positive at the end. So despite everything, is worth it. That was what one of the participants described. I also want to mention that this research was conducted in Portuguese, in the participants' native language, when we gave the option of what language they would prefer. All of the participants decided to be interviewed in Portuguese and complete all the forms in Portuguese. So all of this is translated from their native language, Portuguese. And then I also have in the poster the results of the brief resilience scale for comparison. All these results, some that Brazilians do display high resilience based on this assessment, and the highest score was the I tend to bounce back quickly after hard times, And again, all of these questionnaires were completed in their native language that has been validated in Portuguese. So as a summary, Brazilians in this sample did display high resilience while adapting in the life here in the United States, with also high challenges. They do had high challenges adapting to not having extended family, having to adapt to the language, having to also adapt with the life of their children here, but they seem to build resilience in their communities and finding other Brazilians in the same situation and having a community here. And then they did emphasize that despite everything, it was really worth it. It's still worth the immigration for them. The study was not necessarily designed to emphasize resilience with collectivistic values, but that was the trend that we found. Despite high challenges, we also found high resilience, and we were interested in seeing how the collectivistic, the community building, really seemed to play a role in how the Brazilians felt about their life here in the United States. And then a little bit about our limitation is that this study include a small sample size of 19, and it was limited to Brazilians living in the Pacific Northwest region. So the recommendation would be for future study to replicate with other Brazilians living in a different area of the United States and see how that plays. We do notice that the brief resilience scale is one small questionnaire that we ask to assess resilience. So maybe we could also investigate other ways to see how resilience plays a role in the development of community building for this community. And as I mentioned before, Brazilians are a fast-growing group in the United States. That there's very little to be known about them in the recorded in the literature. So it's really important for us counselors to know how we can support this community, and not only the first generation immigrant Brazilians, but then their offsprings and their children as they are here, they're immigrating and they bring their families as well. So how to integrate and support them long term in the United States. And that's a brief overview of the poster, the research. And now I think that's it. If anybody has questions, please unmute or use the chat. I will try to monitor that. Sarah, just let me know if there's anything else that I should be looking out for or not.
Okay, I'll step in here. You talk about the challenges. What would you say is a challenge that most people might not necessarily think about as being an issue?
The biggest one was definitely the extended family. We also noticed that language was really challenging. Very few resources in Portuguese for the families in the States. Again, Spanish is similar, but not the same. And another challenge was child behavior. Another thing that we noticed that may not be that evident as kids transition from Brazil to United States in various ages. We had, for example, participants with kids from babies, 0 to over 18 years old, and the parents reported a spike in child behavior, of course, I think, with the transition and struggling to navigate the school system. It's very different. Um, the weather, the seasons, as like in the southern hemisphere and northern hemisphere, having to navigate all these things, holidays. That was really interesting, different things, and how to maintain Brazilian traditions um, within the United States, how to maintain Brazilian holidays, how to maintain the language. The bilingualism was really difficult since kids then go to school and learn English and then come home and parents are speaking Portuguese. So then suddenly they don't want to speak Portuguese anymore. They don't have that interest. And parents notice that challenge of maintaining the culture, being their only one. Um, and another thing they also mentioned that might not be that evident is that in Brazil or collectivistic cultures in general, parents don't usually make decisions by themselves. There are extended families there to make decisions. For example, grandparents will give their opinion, uncles, aunties will give their opinion about what to do with kids and, in various different um, aspects of their raising their children. And parents noticed how difficult it was to be the only one to be in charge of their kids. Like I have to decide everything myself. I don't know. I don't have anybody else to ask. That was really interesting since it's such a difference from individualistic in the United States. Like it's they just missed having somebody to sort of guide them and troubleshoot with them some decisions. That was really interesting.
Yeah, and there's parallels though there, I think, in American culture, at least in rural America. And my experiences, being from Appalachia, where you do have extended families that live close by, and yes, people give their input as to what to do with Johnny and and so forth. So yeah, that actually does ring true with me as well.
Mm, yeah, and I think it's suddenly like a heavy load for parents to carry because the responsibility of making the decision suddenly is all on them
Hmm.
versus having that community that shares sort of the raising, like the village is raising the child, right? Versus only the parents. Um, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for this. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. I'm curious to know, having conducted research as well, I know that there's usually some result or some outcome that's really out of left field, surprising, or something you didn't expect. Was there anything that came up for you in this research that was not something you expected?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, as an immigrant, I um, had to watch out for my own biases and do a
Mm.
lot of my own bracketing when I was going through the analysis. I think the sort of the narrative that was told me when I started research Latinx in the US in general is this story of like a very stereotypical poor immigrant, uneducated immigrant. It's just like a this very stereotypical story of suffering, in a way, immigrant. And then I noticed myself thinking, oh, I'm gonna probably see maybe undocumented immigrants, maybe low-income immigrants, all these things that I think I consumed from the research that's so stereotyped, and that was not what I saw at all. So the sample is highly educated. They have a lot of the participants have graduate school completed. They are high income. It was just a very different sample. And I'm not saying that that's like the majority of Latinx in the United States, uh, but that was something I noticed myself like, oh, I'm always, of course, my own, what we read and what we are fed, like this mold of who the Latinx community is in the United States. I was like, oh, it's not. They come here with like high paying jobs and, you know, very high educated and all these things. And I was like, oh, it's not mapping out what is that about and how did I get into the conclusion of. I was very curious and sort of like took a step back to look at all what the data was telling me and what the media sort of like tells me as well, right? So I think that was probably the biggest the demographics in that way.
Yeah, it sounds like it was really unexpected. Yeah. I have one other question, if that's okay.
Of course, I have all the time.
You mentioned that your sample size was smaller and from the Pacific Northwest, and that was a limitation of the study, and that your recommendation is replication. Where if someone were to replicate your study tomorrow, do you have any advice for them? What should they consider or look out for?
Yeah, what I noticed about Brazilians demographic in general, I am from the Pacific Northwest, and I think also a limitation is that I was advertising for groups that were pertinent to my own region. So I think what I noticed is that in the United States, the biggest demographic of just Portuguese speaking people, and therefore also some Brazilian, is in the Massachusetts area. In the Boston area, there's a lot of Portuguese immigrants. So Portuguese is more spoken there. And I think that's a highly desired element for when Brazilians are immigrating. And so there's a lot of Brazilians in the East Coast in that area is what I've noticed. And the very little limited research involving Brazilians in some capacity happens in the Boston area in that sense. So I was excited to do something different, but I also know that there are more Brazilians there. So it would be really cool to see with a larger participant, maybe people who have been in the United States for a long time, what would look like. So I think the East Coast would be really interesting to see like how they build community there, since there are more Brazilians there, and more communities speaking Portuguese there too. I think that would be a region that I would be interested in see how it is. And you're asking what would it be an advice, right? I think I used at the time I did this research right at the peak of the COVID-19. So was March 2020 when we got IRB approval.
Oh,
And
wow.
I know. And originally, I was envisioning a focus group in person. So originally, I was thinking, well, our community loves storytelling, loves to be in community and in present with one another. Let me do something that is geographically local. So I advertised the research to my area because I could do a focus group with them, right? And then COVID hits and we are trying to figure out Zoom and, nobody knows Zoom and what to do. And the IRB recommendation was at that time, well, just do a phone interview. So then these interviews with my participants were actually done in phone format individually. So I had to call each and every one. So they didn't even see me, which I was very disappointed that we couldn't conduct the focal group that I had envisioned, right? And hopefully to give them also, a chance to meet one another if they haven't met. So that was something that was also a limitation. But I think originally thinking, I thought about something in person, like for them. If I knew that we could do something, for example, if I had to do it again tomorrow on Zoom, I would probably then advertise to other groups of Brazilians living in other regions and then bring them together. Now with technology, we know how to do it, right? Like we're doing now. We could do it together then. But back then, we didn't have the knowledge, of course, that we have now. So I think just including Brazilians from all over, if you have to do it online, or then doing in person would probably be my recommendation.
Yeah, I can see what a vast difference that would make. Individual phone conversations versus in-person group conversation, very different. Yeah. But with the advent of Zoom, you could get people from all over. Yeah. So that could be interesting too. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your interest. Yeah, it's just very interesting to think about how Brazilians fit in our community as a large. Where do we intersect? Where do we have a lot of share intersection, and where we don't? And then how do we also make space for all these, different groups that we have within the Latinx community? So thank you so much for being here and for showing interest.
Absolutely.
Okay. I guess we can. There's no questions from our attendee that I see. Then I think perhaps, if you want to continue to hang out here for a while, that would be good.
Sure, I can hang out. Or I know that you mentioned that this has been recorded, or the presentation portion was recorded so people could watch it later. Is that right?
Yeah. And is there a link to fill out for this presentation?
I can put it in the chat. Yes.
Okay, good.
Mm.
And I know I came in a little late. Did the sign-up sheet get sent out, or should I send that one out too? I'll just put it in just in case.
Yeah, I do not know.
Yeah. You said you're in the Pacific Northwest?
I
Are-
am in the Seattle area.
Same. I'm up on Capitol Hill. It just started pouring. Is it pouring where you are?
So I am in Tokyo
Oh,
right
that's
now.
right. That's right.
Right
It is
now,
just like wild.
yeah, right now it's 5:30 in the morning for me, and I have the blinds all closed. I do not know. It's very hot in Tokyo.
Oh,
It was close to 90 degrees yesterday.
oh
Very,
wow, that's
very hot. So
very different.
I heard that in the Seattle we already have some fall weather coming. I don't know if that's true, like fall is already there. Um,
Fall is definitely here. It looks like there's a question in the chat for you.
oh, interesting. So for this research specifically, I um, model the questions based on a dissertation that I found, and then I just adapted the questions to this research. Um, I'm not sure what do you mean by immigration evaluations. Um, because in this case, the only question I had was if they were an immigrant, but I also made sure to not ask about status for this research, um, as they are a vulnerable population. I decided not to include that question in my research. Um, so I just decided to add a demographic question about, are you Brazilian or do you identify as Brazilian? Are you uh, an immigrant to the United States? So I'm not sure about immigration evaluations, but I will say that with immigrants, it's a vulnerable population. So it was something that I discussed with my mentor and my professors about what should we ask, what should we not ask, in terms of reporting for research. And I think one of the things that for parents that was really important is to ask about how the kids were doing with the acculturation process, with the adaptation process here. Um, and I made sure to use some standardized questionnaires. So we used the strengths and challenges questionnaire. That was one that was validated in Portuguese. And as another thing to consider is when interviewing immigrants to pay attention to if that questionnaire is validated with that population, and what language you're going to ask. So I had to make sure that all my questionnaires were validated in Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese and available as well for them. But the strengths and challenges questionnaire was one that I use, and it was well received with them. I hope that answered your question. Great.
Found something interesting online, and it talks about where Brazilian immigrants are located.
Oh,
This is from, yeah, it was updated last in September, yeah, September 6th, 2023. So it's fairly accurate,
that's
I would imagine.
amazing. Fresh news. Yeah, it's interesting. The Boston area seemed to be very, very popular. Yeah, in Florida as well.
Which would make sense.
Yeah. And I was even considering or questioning because I think in the Boston area there are several colleges, right? In the Boston area. So I was thinking, oh well, there are many colleges there, so maybe more research is happening there because of that as well. And one of the few studies, the dissertations, usually in the dissertation form, is what I found, were children of immigrants. In the dissertation, I would see a lot of that. Oh, my parents immigrated, and then I got the opportunity to go to college. So I'm now researching the community, or with the community. So I think that was another trend that I noticed, just like by experience and just by reading, is similar to what is happening to me, I think, right? I'm having the opportunity to go through school, so I'm interested in the community as well. And then Boston area has so many colleges. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the link to the blog post. The odd things you find in a search, which actually, that's not necessarily the nature of the site, but on the other hand, they added this lovely article, and it's like, oh, it's giving me nice numbers.
Oh yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. That's amazing. Yeah, I think for weather, like Brazil is such a big country, and we are more vertical than horizontal. So we have different climates in different regions of the country. So for me, it makes a lot of sense. Warm weather, but Boston seemed to be just a very extreme transition for someone from a tropical country, personally. So it's quite. I wonder also about the weather changes and things like that that you might not see uh, in the sample.
Yeah, and it calls the question as to what would be. Yeah, it would be interesting to hear their stories. Why there, why not somewhere else? Is like here we have a Latino community, or Latinx community here around where I live, which is like about a dozen or so miles from Yellow Springs, Ohio. So you're in Southwest Ohio, and the community has grown over the years, and it got its start from a company that was like raising trees and flowers and that sort of thing. And these were migrant workers who would come in to harvest flowers, harvest trees, whatnot, and go plant those wherever they need to be planted. And so over time, they would come and they would go. And then over time, families started showing up and they started to stay. And so now, yeah, you have a pretty substantial number of people graduating from high school in this area who are of that Latinx or Latino background. And we now actually have a legitimate grocery store, like in the little town of New Carlisle, Ohio, that services that community. So yeah, interesting.
That's amazing. Yeah, and we are the largest minority group in
Yes,
the country. So it
sure.
makes sense that we are spreading all over uh regions, even like Ohio, that you wouldn't imagine.
Sure.
Yeah, it's very cool. I think here what the sample reported, the motivation for immigration was the tech industry. In the Seattle area, that was a big motivation for them receiving a job offer from a tech industry was a big motivation, which I think then pairs up with the income that I saw, with the maybe level of education that I saw. So it was a very particular sample, right, with the boom of the tech industry that we have in the Seattle area with like big companies here. Yeah.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
That would also tend to explain the Boston community as well, I think, because there are some tech firms in that area.
Yeah, it's very interesting and seeing how Brazilians adapt in general and how they make up for the challenges, showing their resilience. I think the resilience in our community just to find other Brazilians that seem to be like the number one way to survive. It's just like, and oh, another thing that I noticed too is that over half of the sample was married and married to Brazilians. So we did have some people intermarriage with Americans, but also the vast majority was married to Brazilians. So it was families immigrating, and then there wasn't many conflicts around cultural differences, like how we are raising our children. We didn't see much conflict between parents because it seemed like a more cohesive sample in that sense.
Well, that follows too with previous immigration of groups, whether we're talking the Germans in the 19 or 1830s, or the Italians around 1900, or Russians at various times, the other ethnic groups who've come over, and they tend to kind of want to be together and be comfortable that way, and that it makes perfect sense. So yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where it gets interesting is 3 generations in, because now the grandchildren might know some of the native language, but not necessarily all of it, and they might still be making the same dishes and having, some of that culture still kind of is retained, but over time they tend to get assimilated
Mhm.
into American culture. And there have been obvious examples of, in the process of that happening, American culture being influenced as well. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Happening both directions, right?
right.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna see what happens later as these second generation uh, kids grow up, and you see what happens, and so on, third generation, so on and so forth.
Sure. Let's see, we have about 12 minutes left.
Right. I'll keep monitoring the chat just in case something pops in.
Okay.
Otherwise, we'll hang out. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, I've noticed a few people have kind of migrated in and migrated out over time. So, yeah.
And it's my first time attending a online poster session. I've been
Yes.
to many in-person poster sessions where people just sort of meander and stop at different posters and, just leave. And it's just a very, I think, very interesting dynamic online. Uh,
Yeah, I know. And we were kind of talking amongst ourselves, the tech crew and the support people, about, how can we make things better, for the Expo area. And, I think if we uh, had more sessions, maybe, but shorter ones, that might be,
uh,
that might be good too. So that people are sort of encouraged to kind of listen to a 10-15 minute talk and then off to the next one, off to the next one.
Mhm.
So then you would, you might end up repeating the same talk a few times, but
Yeah, pretty similar then to like an in-person, I think, experience. It's just,
yeah.
I think technology is beautiful and it can be really, really helpful to propagate ideas. And it sometimes just doesn't, it's not enough to replace like the in-person.
Hmm.
Uh, so I know we're all learning how to best use like all of our tools.
Well, you go back to say 1983. To do what we're doing right now would have required a satellite, would have required cameras, like real cameras, not webcams. And yeah, and then there would be time delays because I would talk and then so many seconds later you would hear what I said. And then so many seconds later you would be talking and then I would hear what you said. So yeah, no, but now with the internet, it's basically instantaneous. So, and we're using, well, I got a little higher end webcam up here, but yeah, you could theoretically go with the $29 model and do essentially the same thing.
And you hear me all the way from across the world instantaneously.
Yeah, crazy.
It's almost magic. Even 4 years ago, this wasn't possible.
Yeah, even when I did the research, wasn't possible.
4 or 5 years
Oh,
ago, my doctorate was a hybrid program, and so we did a lot of our classes. What did we use? We used Adobe Connect, and people were always dropping off, and the visual quality was terrible, and the audio quality was terrible, and that was just like 6 years ago. So
and it was complex, and you had to kind of, we had to train people because we had Adobe Connect at Antioch,
oh
for
yeah,
some
yeah,
faculty,
yeah.
and we had a limited number of licenses, and you had to be trained in advance because the thing was so complex that it would be, if you just sat down to do it, it was like, oof, not very good. So yeah, when Zoom came along, um, you had Google Hangouts at that point, or whatever they were calling it before that.
Mhm,
And when it was first introduced, it was fine, but then the quality went downhill over time,
mhm.
which is probably why you now have Google Teams, because they realized that it was going downhill and they wanted to replace it. But yeah, I mean, at the time we were like, okay, there's this Zoom thing, and the people in the PhD in Leadership and Change program had already adopted Zoom, like in the early days. And like, oh, hey, this is really cool, and the video quality is really great. And so, us in the academic technology realm, we're kind of like, oh, okay, well, we'll take a look at it and see what you're doing. It's like, wait a minute, where has this been?
Pretty cool.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I became an advocate for it across the institution at that day. It's like, no, we got to get this. We got to get this now. Everyone needs it.
Mhm.
So by the time we got to the pandemic, we were ready. It's like, okay, we can roll out the remaining licenses, whoever needs one, and boom. I mean, as it was kind of like on demand. By the time we got to February of 2020, we got to that point. We got an institutional license, and it's like, if you want one, you get one. But
We were
as of that, as of like, of March of 2020, it was, here's yours.
ready.
Not, asking you'll receive. No, it's no, here.
Yeah. Yeah, we
And we
were ready
had
to
training sessions
go.
online for all the faculty and whatever students wanted to show up. And we will, you are where you are now. And this Zoom events is the latest thing, in sort of that Zoom suite of software. We have the Zoom meetings, of course, Zoom webinars, and now this, which incorporates meetings and webinars and everything and makes it into one big coherent package.
Yeah, when did this launch, Harold? This is my first experience with like signing into a lobby and choosing rooms from there. When did that
Yeah.
start?
This launched a couple years ago,
Okay.
and they've been making improvements ever since. When it first launched, it was like, what do you mean it won't do it like it does in the regulars meeting? What do you mean it won't do it in the webinar, regular webinar? But over time, it started doing, the behavior was more emulating what you would see in an individual webinar or individual meeting. And the communications tools have improved everything. It's just been a gradual process, getting better and better.
Yeah,
So yeah.
it's
And every
really cool.
once in a while
The
you're running,
option
yeah. Every
the
once in a while you
option
run,
for backstage is
yeah.
cool. Like every once in a while, what?
Say every once in a while you run into something that's a little quirky that you're kind of like, really? But that's becoming more rarer and rarer now. Which yeah. So I'm sorry I kept interrupting you, and you kept.
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay.
I'm just impressed. I think it's really neat.
Yeah. Okay.
Stop my share.
All right. I think we can wrap this up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your questions, for your interest. That has been really interesting and a great opportunity for me to talk more about my community and also gain this knowledge of what it's like to be on Zoom. I really appreciate your all time and interest. And if you have further questions, you want to connect as a researcher, as being in the same area, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Absolutely.
I think my
Same.
email is somewhere out there, but let me put it in the chat just in case.
Okay.
1 second. I have a very long lesson. There it is, in case there are any questions or anything.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.